Consider for a moment the weight of a single decision, not measured in days or years, but in millennia. 10,000 years ago, in a land that would one day be called Westeros, two species stood at the precipice of mutual annihilation. What happened next would echo through every generation that followed, a testament to the most remarkable strategic compromise ever achieved between fundamentally different forms of consciousness. The first men had crossed the Arm of Dawn 12,000 years before our tale truly begins, bringing bronze and fire to a land that had known neither. Imagine witnessing this first invasion not of conquest as we understand it, but of transformation. They came in leather and fur, bearing weapons that gleamed like captured sunlight, into forests so vast and ancient that some trees had stood for 8,000 years. The children of the forest, those who had called this land home since the dawn of days, watched from between the weirwood leaves as these newcomers cut and burned, shaped and claimed. Here was the first strategic truth written into the very soil of Westeros. Those who control the materials of war control the outcome of conflict. Bronze, that miraculous alloy of copper and tin, represented more than mere metal. It was organized knowledge, the marriage of mining and metallurgy, requiring not just raw materials but the accumulated wisdom of generations. The children possessed magic, could speak to ravens and see through the eyes of trees, but they had never needed to master the earth's minerals. They were the forest, and the forest was them. The war that followed lasted 2,000 years. 2,000 years, let that settle into your consciousness. The entirety of our recorded human history, from Caesar to smartphones, could fit into this single conflict. Yet what makes this war remarkable isn't its length but its conclusion. The pact at the Isle of Faces stands as perhaps the greatest strategic masterstroke in all of history, a solution so elegant that it transformed inevitable extinction into coexistence. Consider the genius of the agreement. The first men would keep the coastlands, the high plains, the bright meadows and mountains and bogs. The children would keep the deep woods and the forest lands. No more weirwoods would be cut down. It was territorial compromise elevated to art. Each species retained what they valued most. The first men gained the lands suited for agriculture and expansion, while the children preserved their sacred groves and the network of seeing trees that formed their consciousness. But here's what makes this ancient treaty truly extraordinary. Both sides recognized that total victory would be mutual defeat. The first men could have eventually overwhelmed the children through numbers and bronze weapons, but at what cost? Every forest burned meant less game to hunt, less wood for building, less protection from winter storms. The children could have retreated deeper into hostile magic, poisoning every stream and turning the very trees against the invaders. But they too understood that isolation meant slow extinction. The pact wasn't surrender, it was evolution. The strategic implications rippled forward through time like waves from a dropped stone. The first men learned the old gods' worship from the children, carving faces into weirwoods, adopting the very spirituality of those they'd once fought. Think about that transformation, conquerors becoming converts, not through defeat but through wisdom. The children, in turn, gained protection from future threats, their magic preserved in the north where the old gods remained strong. 4,000 years of peace followed. 4,000 years when bronze slowly gave way to iron, when the first men built their kingdoms and holdfasts, when the children slowly faded but never fully disappeared. This wasn't just coexistence, it was strategic symbiosis. The first men became the shield, while the children became the memory. Then came the Andals. If the first men's arrival was a steady tide, the Andal invasion was a tsunami of steel and certainty. 6,000 years ago, they crossed the narrow sea, fleeing the expansion of Valyria, though they didn't come as refugees but as crusaders. Where the first men brought bronze, the Andals brought iron, and with it, a revolution in warfare so complete it reshaped the continent's destiny. Iron. Pause to contemplate this element. the fourth most common in the Earth's crust, yet hidden in ore that requires 1500 degrees Celsius to release. Iron weapons could shatter bronze, cut through leather, hold an edge that stayed sharp through an entire battle. But the Andals brought something even more powerful than iron. They brought unified purpose through the faith of the Seven. Watch how they conquered, not as a single massive invasion, but as hundreds of smaller ones, each warband carved with seven-pointed stars, each warrior absolutely certain of their righteousness. The strategic brilliance lay not in their tactics, but in their ideology. The old gods were tied to trees and locations, defend the weirwood, hold the sacred grove. The Seven travelled in the heart of every convert, portable and infinitely reproducible. Every Andal warrior carried their gods with them, while the first men had to defend specific sacred sites. The Andals understood a fundamental truth about power. Military superiority means nothing without administrative replacement. As they conquered each kingdom, they didn't just defeat the first men kings, they replaced the entire structure. Andal warriors became lords, Andal customs became law, and most crucially, septs replaced godswoods. They offered the conquered first men a choice that wasn't really a choice: convert or perish. Most converted. But observe the exception that proves the rule: the North. Here, the strategic geography that had once benefited the first men now became their salvation. The neck, that treacherous expanse of swamp and quicksand, formed a natural choke point that neutralized the Andals' numerical advantage. The Cranogmen, those descendants of the first men who had intermarried with the children, turned the wetlands into a killing field, where iron armor became a death trap, where every stream might be poisoned, where the very ground could swallow an army. Moat Cailin stands as a monument to defensive strategic thinking. 3 towers, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, controlling the only causeway through the neck. The Andals tried for centuries to take it. They failed every single time. The North remained unconquered, the old gods remained strong, and the weirwoods continued their silent watch. Yet in the south, the Andal conquest was total. Within a few centuries, the first men nobility had either died out or intermarried so thoroughly that the distinction became meaningless. The children of the forest, who had no place in the faith of the Seven's cosmology, retreated beyond the wall or into the deepest forests. The weirwoods were cut down, their faces carved away, their wood used for septs and castles. Each tree that fell was a strategic victory, not just removing a sacred site, but severing the children's network of sight. Now we must turn our gaze eastward, to the pinnacle of strategic dominance, Valyria and its dragons. 5,000 years ago, in volcanic peninsulas where 14 flames pierced the sky, shepherds discovered something that would reshape the definition of power itself: dragons. Not the last lingering beasts of a dying age, but dragons in their prime, creatures of such magnificent terror that their mere existence rewrote the rules of warfare. Valyria's expansion model was breathtakingly simple: dragon superiority, plus infrastructure investment, plus slavery, economics, equals empire. They didn't just conquer, they transformed. The Valyrian roads, fused stones straight as arrows, connected their Remet empire more efficiently than anything built before or since. Their military strategy relied on combined arms at a scale previously unimaginable, dragons providing air superiority, while slave legions held the ground, supported by blood magic that could reshape the very earth. But here's what made Valyria truly unstoppable. They understood that dragons were both weapon and weakness. Dragons required specific conditions to thrive: volcanic heat, certain minerals in their diet, and most crucially, riders of Valyrian blood. This created a closed loop of power. Only Valyrians could ride dragons, so only Valyrians could rule, So all resources flowed to maintain Valyrian supremacy, which meant more dragons, which meant more power. Obsidian dragon glass became the hidden cornerstone of their might. Forged in dragon flame and volcanic fury, these glass blades could hold an edge sharper than steel, could pierce armor that turned iron swords, and most mysteriously, could kill creatures that no other weapon could touch. The Valyrians controlled the obsidian trade like a strategic resource, parceling it out to allies, withholding it from enemies. Think about the mathematical elegance of their system. 40 families of dragon lords ruling an empire that spanned half the known world. Each family might have 5 to 10 dragons, creating an air force of between 200 and 400 dragons at the empire's height. No coalition of enemies could match even a fraction of that power. A single dragon could destroy an army. 3 dragons could take a kingdom. Hundreds of dragons made rebellion not just futile but literally unthinkable. Yet Valyria's greatest strategic innovation wasn't dragons, it was the systematic application of slavery as an economic engine. Every conquered people became fuel for the empire's expansion. The mines that produced the wealth, the farms that fed the cities, the construction projects that built the infrastructure, all powered by millions of slaves whose labor cost nothing but maintenance. It was ruthlessly efficient and utterly sustainable as long as the dragons lived. The Valyrians sold obsidian to the Westerosi, traded with the Summer Isles, and established colonies from Lys to Volantis. Each interaction was calculated for maximum strategic advantage. They never conquered Westeros, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Westeros provided raw materials and markets without the administrative burden of occupation. Why waste dragons conquering a land of stubborn first men and Andals when those same people would pay premium prices for Valyrian steel and obsidian? But hidden in this strategic mastery was a fatal flaw: centralization. All power flowed through Valyria itself. All dragons returned to nest in the volcanic heat. All Dragonlord families maintained their seats in the peninsula. When the Doom came, and we still don't truly understand what caused that cataclysm, it destroyed not just a city but an entire system of power. In a single day, 4 centuries of dragon supremacy ended in flame and ash. Only one family survived with their dragons intact: the Targaryens of Dragonstone. They had been mocked by other dragon lords for their paranoid flight to a distant island, dismissed as dragon dreamers fleeing shadows. Yet their strategic positioning far enough to escape the Doom, close enough to maintain their power, would reshape the world once more. As we consider these ancient power structures, a pattern emerges that transcends any single conquest. Bronze gave way to iron, iron yielded to steel, and all mortal metals bent before Dragonflame. But observe the deeper truth. Each transformation required not just superior weapons, but superior organization. The first men brought tribal hierarchy. The Andals brought religious unity. The Valyrians brought systematic empire. Each wave didn't just conquer it, it fundamentally restructured how power itself functioned. The obsidian beneath, Dragonstone and the frozen wastes beyond the wall, the iron in the northern hills and the riverlands, the remaining Valyrian steel blades scattered across noble houses. These aren't just resources, they're crystallized potential, waiting for the strategic genius who understands how to transform material advantage into lasting dominance. Consider for a moment what this tells us about the nature of power itself. It isn't enough to possess the sharpest sword or the largest army. True strategic mastery comes from understanding the system, recognizing which resources matter, controlling their flow, and most crucially, knowing when old advantages become new weaknesses. The children's magic couldn't stop bronze. Bronze couldn't stop iron. Iron couldn't stop dragons. And dragons, as we'll see, couldn't stop their own extinction. The first men understood this when they made their pact, trading total victory for sustainable peace. The Andals understood it when they replaced gods as thoroughly as they replaced kings. The Valyrians understood it when they built an empire on dragon wings and slave backs. Each dominant power contained within itself the seeds of its own replacement, yet also left traces that would echo through every age that followed. Today, in Westeros, a knight's sword might be castle-forged steel, but the words he speaks when taking vows echo Andal tradition. A northern lord might worship in a sept, but he'll still seek wisdom in the godswood. Obsidian daggers, forgotten for centuries, rest in ancient vaults, their volcanic glass as sharp as the day they were made. These aren't relics, they're dormant strategies, waiting for the world to change enough that old solutions become new answers. The Game of Thrones, as we call it now, isn't just about who sits on an iron chair. It's about understanding these deep currents of power, recognizing that every resource from the humblest iron mine to the last obsidian cache represents potential revolution. Those who master these materials master the realm, but those who understand their limits might just survive what's coming. For in the end, bronze, iron, and obsidian aren't just elements. They're ideas made manifest, strategies given form, power crystallized into something you can hold in your hand. And as we'll discover in our next chapter, when Valyria fell and its dragons became memory, one family's strategic foresight would transform 3 dragon eggs and a smoking island into the foundation for conquering a continent. The doom of one empire would become the birth of another, proving once again that in the game of strategic dominance, the greatest weapon isn't what you wield. It's understanding when and how to wield it. 12 years before the doom of Valyria, a young woman named Daenerys Targaryen woke screaming from a dream of fire. Not ordinary fire. She had seen the very earth split open, seen the 14 flames that had burned for 5,000 years suddenly turn inward, seen dragon lords consumed by their own element. She saw the end of the world, or at least, the end of the world that mattered. Consider the weight of that moment. You wake from a nightmare, and in that nightmare, you've seen your entire civilization die. Every rational thought tells you it's merely a dream. The Valyrian freehold has stood for 5 millennia. 400 dragons nest in the volcanic peaks. 40 Dragonlord families command power that makes gods seem modest. The greatest city ever built, home to wonders we still can't replicate, pulsing with the heartbeat of empire. And you, a young woman from a minor Dragonlord family, have seen it all turn to ash and shadow. What would you do? Most would dismiss it. But Daenerys' father, Aenar Targaryen, made a decision that would reshape the fate of the known world. He listened. More than listened, he acted. He sold his holdings in Valyria, packed his entire household, took his 5 dragons, and sailed west to a smoking volcanic island at the edge of nowhere. The other Dragonlord families mocked him. "There goes Lord Aenar," they laughed, "fleeing shadows and dreams, cowering on his rock while we rule the world." They laughed for 12 years. Then they burned. The doom came exactly as Daenerys had foreseen. In a single day, perhaps in a single hour, the Valyrian peninsula shattered. The 14 flames exploded with such force that the earth itself cracked like an egg. The sea rushed in, boiling instantly into steam that rose in clouds visible from Slaver's Bay. Dragon lords on their dragons were consumed mid-flight, the very air turning to flame around them. Every dragon, every rider, every bloodline that had ruled for 5,000 years gone. Every bloodline except one. Imagine being Aenar Targaryen on Dragonstone that day. You see the eastern sky turn red at midday. You feel the ground shake even hundreds of miles away. The sea pulls back from your shores, then returns in waves 100 feet high. And you realize that your daughter's dream, the dream that made you a laughingstock, has just made you the most powerful man in the world. You have the only dragons left in existence. But here's where the strategic genius truly begins. A lesser mind would have immediately pressed this advantage, flying to claim Valyria's colonies while they reeled in shock. Einar did nothing. He stayed on Dragonstone and waited. This wasn't cowardice or indecision, it was perhaps the most brilliant strategic patience ever displayed. He understood a fundamental truth. In chaos, the first mover often becomes the first target. Watch what happened in those immediate months after the doom. Volantis, first and proudest of the free cities, declared itself the heir to Valyria. The Tigers, the old blood who traced their lineage to Valyria, seized control and proclaimed a new empire. They had the largest fleet, the strongest walls, the most disciplined armies. What they didn't have were dragons. But they moved anyway, sending their armies east and west, trying to grab as much as they could before others recovered from the shock. Tyrosh and Lys, sister cities founded by the same Valyrian adventurers, immediately went to war with each other. Think about the absurdity of that. The empire that created you just died, and your first instinct is to attack your sibling. But it made perfect strategic sense. Without Valyria's iron hand, every colony became a competitor. Better to strike first while your neighbour was still stunned. Myr began hiring every sellsword company in Essos. Pentos started building walls. Qohor paid the Unsullied whatever they asked. Norvos retreated behind its hills and rang its bells in mourning, or was it celebration? The Dothraki, held at bay for centuries by dragon fear, suddenly discovered that the grass roads led to cities without protectors. The first Khalasars began forming, testing the edges of what had been forbidden territory, and on Dragonstone, Einar Targaryen did nothing. He could have flown to Volantis and proclaimed himself emperor. He could have burned the Dothraki before they became a threat. He could have imposed order on the chaos. Instead, he tended his dragons, maintained his island, and watched. When he died, his son Gaemon continued the same policy, as did his son Aegon after him. For over a century, the Targaryens sat on their smoking rock and did absolutely nothing with the greatest military advantage in the world. This wasn't waste, it was investment. Every year that passed, the free cities exhausted themselves in wars. Every year that passed, the memory of dragon fear faded in Essos, but remained theoretical, mythical, impossible to plan against. Every year that passed, the Targaryens studied. They had something none of the free cities possessed: time. Dragonstone itself tells us everything about Targaryen strategic thinking. Look at it, a volcanic island, difficult to assault, impossible to starve out, positioned perfectly at the mouth of Bonnet, Blackwater Bay. From here, you can strike anywhere on the eastern coast of Westeros within a day's dragon flight. From here, you control all naval trade entering the narrow sea. From here, you can watch everything while revealing nothing. The Targaryens spent a century turning this rock into the perfect forward operating base. They carved the castle from the volcano itself using techniques now lost to us, dragon flame and Valyrian magic shaping stone like clay. Every tower shaped like a dragon, every wall designed to channel attackers into killing fields, every chamber built to house dragons comfortably. They weren't building a castle, they were building a launching pad for conquest. But the true genius lay in what they studied during their long wait. The Targaryens became the greatest intelligence operation in the known world, without anyone realizing it. They sent traders to every port, gathering maps and measuring distances. They learned the lineages of every house in Westeros, understood who hated whom, who owed whom, who could be bought, and who would die rather than bend. They studied weather patterns when storms made naval invasion impossible, when winters made armies vulnerable. They learned where every castle stored its grain, where every army recruited its soldiers. Most crucially, they studied the dragons themselves. In Valyria, dragon knowledge was dispersed among 40 families, each guarding their secrets jealously. But the Targaryens now had all the remaining dragons, and all the time in the world to understand them. They learned that dragons bond with only one rider at a time. They discovered that dragon eggs need specific conditions to hatch heat beyond normal fire, and perhaps something more, something in the blood. They realized that dragons never stop growing if given enough food and freedom. Balerion, the Black Dread, was already over a century old and showed no signs of declining. Meanwhile, Westeros slumbered in its false security. The Seven Kingdoms genuinely believed they were seven separate kingdoms, each sovereign, each supreme in its own domain. The Reach could feed the continent but couldn't project power without exposing its fertile fields. The Westerlands had gold but vulnerable coasts. The Stormlands had fierce warriors but no unity. The Riverlands had strategic position but no natural defences. The North had size and isolation but moved too slowly to threaten anyone. The Iron Islands had the best navy but couldn't hold mainland territory. Dorne had defensive advantages but limited offensive capability. Each kingdom had evolved perfect strategies for fighting the others. The Gardener Kings of the Reach knew exactly how to counter Lannister gold, flood the market with grain, create dependency, then threaten starvation. The Storm Kings had perfected the art of defensive warfare, letting enemies exhaust themselves against their castles. The Kings of Winter could simply retreat north and let winter destroy any invader. For thousands of years, these strategies had created a perfect stalemate, a balance of power so intricate that no kingdom could dominate the others. They were all preparing for the wrong war. Aegon Targaryen, later called the Conqueror, though he hadn't conquered anything yet understood something fundamental about military revolution. When the paradigm shifts, all previous strategies don't just become obsolete, they become actively harmful. Every castle that had made a kingdom strong became a stationary target for dragonfire. Every army gathered for protection became clustered fuel for annihilation. Every naval advantage became irrelevant when the enemy attacked from above. But Aegon's true genius wasn't recognizing this advantage. Any fool with a dragon could see that. His genius lay in recognizing the perfect moment to use it. By the time he decided to act, several crucial factors had aligned. First, the free cities had exhausted themselves in a century of wars. Volantis' attempt at empire had failed spectacularly, leaving no eastern power capable of taking advantage if the Targaryens committed to a western campaign. Second, Westeros had just experienced a generation of particularly bitter conflicts. The River Kings were failing, the Storm King was aging, the Iron Islands were overextended. The continent was divided, tired and complacent. Most importantly, Aegon had done something his ancestors hadn't. He'd visited Westeros. As a young man, he'd travelled the continent extensively, officially as a tourist, actually as a scout. He'd seen the walls of Old Town and calculated how many seconds of dragon flame would melt them. He'd observed the Field of Plenty and understood how losing one harvest would cripple the Reach. He'd studied the Neck and realized that the natural defense that had stopped the Andals meant nothing to creatures that could fly. The final piece of Aegon's preparation was perhaps the most brilliant. He built a new seat of power before he had any power to seat. On the highest hill of what would become King's Landing, he constructed the Aegon Fort, a simple wooden structure that nonetheless proclaimed intention. This wasn't a raid or an invasion. This was colonization. He was telling Westeros, "I'm not here to destroy and leave. I'm here to stay and rule." Consider the psychological impact of that fort. Every lord who saw it understood that Aegon wasn't playing by the old rules. Invaders took castles. They didn't build new ones. Conquerors seized capitals. They didn't found them. By creating a new center of power, Aegon was announcing that the old world was ending and a new one beginning. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Targaryen strategy was what they didn't do. They didn't try to reclaim Valeria's empire. The smoking ruins of the peninsula remained forbidden, cursed, dying. Ships that sailed into the smoking sea never returned. The few expeditions that skirted the edges reported water that boiled without fire, air that turned poison in your lungs, and worse things, whispers of stone men and fireworms and horrors that had no names. The Targaryens never even attempted to reclaim their ancestral homeland. They understood what the free cities didn't. Valyria wasn't just destroyed, it was transformed into something antithetical to life itself. The doom hadn't ended with the explosion. It had created a wound in the world that would never heal. Trying to rebuild Valyria would be like trying to rebuild a song from its echo. The form might be similar, but the essence would be forever lost. Instead, the Targaryens looked west to virgin territory. Virgin in the sense that no dragon lords had ever claimed it. Westeros had never known Valyrian dominion, had never seen dragons as anything but distant traders' tales. The continent's isolation, which had protected it for millennia, now made it perfect for conquest. No allies would come to its aid. No fellow dragon lords would contest the claim. It was a kingdom-sized gift waiting for someone with the power to unwrap it. The doom dividend, as we might call it, wasn't just about inheriting dragons. It was about inheriting them at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, with exactly the right preparation. Every other power that might have contested Targaryen supremacy was either dead in Valyria, exhausted in Essos, or ignorant in Westeros. The Targaryens had won a lottery where they were the only ones who knew the drawing was happening. But there was one more factor that made the Targaryen position perfect. Prophecy. The dragon's dreams that had saved them from the doom created a sense of destiny that went beyond mere ambition. When Aegon looked west, he wasn't just seeing conquest, he was seeing fate. The same blood that let them ride dragons let them dream the future, or at least dream a future. This certainty, this absolute conviction that they were meant to rule, gave them a psychological edge as powerful as their dragons. Think about facing an enemy who genuinely believes destiny itself is on their side. Every victory confirms their prophecy. Every defeat is merely a test before ultimate triumph. You're not just fighting a man or even a dragon, you're fighting the weight of perceived fate itself. How do you defeat an enemy who treats your resistance as proof of their eventual victory? The free cities understood this power, which is why they never united against the Targaryens despite the obvious threat. Each city made its own calculations. Better to trade with dragon lords than fight them. Better to let them have Westeros than risk them turning east. They had learned from Valyria's history that dragon riders made better customers than conquerors. Let the Targaryens have their western kingdom. The free cities would profit from the trade. This was the hidden genius of the Targaryen choice. By moving west instead of east, they avoided triggering a coalition that might have actually threatened them. 3 dragons were overwhelming against divided kingdoms, but might have struggled against 9 free cities united in desperation. By choosing Westeros, the Targaryens picked the perfect opponent. Rich enough to be worth conquering, divided enough to be conquered, isolated enough that no help would come. As Aegon stood on Dragonstone, looking west toward a continent that didn't yet know its fate was sealed, he held advantages his ancestors could never have imagined. Not just dragons, the Valyrian freehold had possessed hundreds of those. He had exclusivity. He had intelligence gathered over a century. He had a continent exhausted from its own conflicts. He had the lessons of Valyria's rise and fall. Most importantly, he had patience inherited from 100 years of waiting. The doom of Valyria had destroyed the world's greatest empire, but from its ashes came something perhaps more dangerous, a focused, patient, strategically brilliant power with no peers and no rivals. The Targaryens didn't need to rebuild Valyria's empire because they were about to create something better, a kingdom forged by dragons, but sustained by strategy, held not just by fear, but by the careful manipulation of existing power structures. In our next chapter, we'll see how Aegon transformed these advantages into action, how 3 dragons and fewer than 2,000 soldiers conquered a continent of millions. We'll discover why some kingdoms fell in days while others took years, and why the throne Aegon built from the swords of his enemies was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. The conquest of Westeros wasn't just a military campaign, it was a masterclass in psychological warfare, strategic mercy, and the mathematics of submission. 2,000 men, 3 dragons, 7 kingdoms containing perhaps 3 million souls. On parchment, the mathematics seem impossible, a rounding error attempting to conquer a continent. Yet within 2 years, Aegon Targaryen had transformed those absurd numbers into the arithmetic of absolute dominion. How does one explain such an equation? How does 2,000 defeat 3 million? The answer lies not in the numbers, but in the psychology between them. Aegon understood something that military historians often miss. Conquest isn't about defeating every soldier, it's about defeating every soldier's will to fight. And nothing, absolutely nothing in the history of human warfare defeats the will quite like watching your castle melt like a candle in the sundae. Let us begin at the beginning, on the day Aegon Targaryen landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with his sisters, his dragons, and his modest host. Picture that moment, fishing villages watching as longships beach themselves, as soldiers in foreign armour establish camp, as 3 creatures from legend unfold wings that block out the Sunday. The fishermen didn't flee immediately. They watched, transfixed, as Aegon had his men build a wooden fort atop the highest hill. Only when Balerion roared a sound that vibrated through the earth itself did they run. And here we see Aegon's first strategic masterstroke. He let them run. More than that, he made sure they survived to run. Those fishermen became his unwitting heralds, spreading through the countryside with tales that grew with each telling. By sunset, every village within 50 miles knew that dragons had come to Westeros. By week's end, half the continent had heard. Fear travels faster than any army, and Aegon knew that terror was his most efficient recruiting sergeant. But terror alone doesn't conquer kingdoms, it merely scatters them. Aegon's genius lay in offering an alternative to terror so reasonable, so generous, that resistance seemed not just futile but foolish. His terms were startlingly simple. Bend the knee, keep your lands, keep your titles, keep your laws, and in return, receive the protection of dragons. Not the threat, the protection. Submit to me, Aegon said, and you'll never need fear anyone else again. Consider the elegant psychology of this offer. Traditional conquerors demanded treasure, hostages, and humiliation. They stripped defeated lords of their ancestral holdings, installed foreign governors, imposed alien laws. Aegon asked for only one thing: acknowledgement. Bend the knee, say the words, and nothing else changes except now you have dragons protecting you instead of threatening you. It was submission transformed into subscription, join my kingdom and receive benefits unavailable anywhere else. The first to understand this mathematics was, surprisingly, not a lord at all but a priestess. When Aegon sent his sister Visenya to demand the submission of Crackclaw Point, she found herself facing dozens of petty lords who had squabbled for centuries, united only in their refusal to kneel to outsiders. Visenya could have burned them all. One pass of Vhagar would have ended all resistance. Instead, she made them an offer that revealed the true genius of Targaryen strategy. "You have never bent the knee to any king," she said. "Bend now to mine, and you never will again. You'll answer only to the Iron Throne, never to River Kings or Storm Kings or any other lord who claims dominion over you. Your sons will be knights, your daughters will be ladies. Your harbours will be protected by dragon wings. And when enemies come, and they always come, you'll send a raven to King's Landing, and fire will fall from the sky to defend you." Every single lord of Crackclaw Point bent the knee that day, not from fear, though Vhagar's presence certainly helped, but from calculation. They were being offered a better deal than they'd ever had: direct vassalage to a king, too powerful to fail, too distant to micromanage, too pragmatic to care about their local customs. The mathematics were undeniable. Submission plus dragons equaled safety and prosperity. But not everyone could calculate so clearly. Some lords, raised on thousands of years of independence, simply couldn't process the new reality. They prepared for war as they always had, gathering armies, fortifying castles, forming alliances. They were playing chess while Aegon had introduced fighter jets to the board. The first great lesson came at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where the forces of Lords Errol, Fell and Buckler moved to destroy Aegon's beachhead before he could establish himself. 3,000 men marched toward what they assumed would be an easy victory against foreign invaders. They were met by Queen Rhaenys on Meraxes. Imagine being a soldier in that army. You've trained your whole life for war. You know how battles work, shield walls and cavalry charges, arrows and spears, mud and blood and glory. Then a shadow passes overhead, larger than anything should be, and suddenly the man beside you is on fire. Not burning on fire, instantly, completely. The heat hits you like a physical wall. Your armor, meant to protect you, becomes an oven. The sword in your hand glows red, then white, too hot to hold. Men aren't dying, they're evaporating. Rhaenys burned the vanguard and left the rest alive. This wasn't mercy, it was mathematics. Dead men tell no tales, but traumatized men tell nothing but tales. Those survivors spread across the Stormlands and beyond, each one a living testament to the futility of traditional warfare against dragons. Aegon had transformed 3,000 enemies into 3,000 evangelists for submission, but the true mathematical genius revealed itself in how Aegon handled those who did submit. Lords Errol, Fell and Buckler, who had just tried to kill him, were welcomed into his peace. Their lands weren't seized, their children weren't taken as hostages. They were simply required to swear fealty and provide troops for Aegon's continuing conquest. Yesterday's enemies became today's allies, not through negotiation but through simple arithmetic, fight and die, or submit and prosper. This pattern repeated across the continent, but each time with subtle variations that showed Aegon's strategic adaptability. When Daemon Velaryon, master of ships, led the Targaryen fleet against the Gullet, he found House Massey ready to fight. But instead of attacking, he invited Lord Massey aboard his flagship, showed him the dragons circling overhead, and offered him a choice and a gift. The choice, submission or annihilation. The gift, marriage to a Targaryen ally and a seat on the future small council. Lord Massey bent the knee before his feet touched the deck. Mathematics again. Certain death versus certain advancement. The calculation took seconds. The submission of Rosby and Stokeworth followed an even more elegant formula. These minor houses, seeing the fate of their neighbours, didn't wait for Aegon to arrive. They came to him, bending the knee preemptively. Aegon rewarded this foresight by confirming all their holdings and adding new ones seized from those who resisted. The message was clear. The earlier you submitted, the greater your rewards. Resistance would be punished, reluctance would be accepted, but enthusiasm would be celebrated. This created what we might call a cascade effect. Each submission made the next one more likely. Lords watched their neighbours bend the knee and prosper, watched resistors burn and die, and made the only rational choice. It was peer pressure elevated to an art form, submission as social contagion. By the time Aegon's forces reached a new region, half the lords were already racing to be first to kneel. The mathematics reached their purest expression with House Tully. The Tullys were not kings, not even paramount lords, merely one of many river houses sworn to the failing king of the isles and rivers. But Edmund Tully understood the new mathematics better than anyone. When Aegon arrived, Edmund not only bent the knee immediately, but convinced or coerced the other river lords to do the same. His reward? Aegon made him Lord Paramount of the Trident, elevating a minor house above all its former equals and some of its former superiors. Think about the strategic brilliance of this appointment. Every river lord who had hesitated now lived beneath someone who had submitted faster. Every future ambitious house could see the path to advancement, be first to kneel when the world changes. Aegon had transformed submission from surrender into opportunity. The mathematics were irresistible. Resist and lose everything. Submit and possibly gain more than you ever had. But some kingdoms required different calculations. The Reach, the most populous and fertile of the 7 kingdoms, presented Aegon with his greatest mathematical challenge. King Mern IX commanded an army of 55,000 men, the largest host ever assembled in Westeros at that time. Even with dragons, those numbers mattered. 55,000 archers firing simultaneously could darken the sky. Dragons had to land eventually, and when they did, sheer numbers might overwhelm them. The Field of Fire became Aegon's mathematical masterpiece. He let King Mern and King Loren of the Rock combine their forces, nearly 60,000 men in total. He let them choose the battlefield. He let them form their lines and sound their trumpets and charge with absolute confidence. Then he and his sisters took to the sky on all 3 dragons at once, the only time in the conquest they would do so, and introduced Westeros to the mathematics of industrial warfare. 4,000 men died in minutes. 4,000, but here's the crucial detail, not 40,000. Aegon could have burned them all. The dragons had enough flame, enough fury to turn that entire army to ash, but he didn't. He burned enough to break their will, then landed Balerion in full view of the survivors, and waited. King Mern was dead, consumed in dragon flame, along with his sons and sworn swords. King Loren lived, his army shattered around him. The arithmetic was displayed in corpses and screams. This is what resistance costs. This is what submission saves. Loren Lannister bent the knee on that field, surrounded by the dead and dying, and was immediately confirmed as Lord of Casterly Rock and Warden of the West. The survivors of the Gardner host, leaderless and terrified, were offered the same terms as always: bend the knee and go home. Most did. The mathematics of the Field of Fire echoed across Westeros. 60,000 faced 3 dragons, 4,000 died, 56,000 lived because one king was wise enough to kneel. But the true mathematical genius wasn't just in the killing, it was in what Aegon did with the survivors. The Tyrells, stewards to the dead House Gardner, had surrendered Highgarden without a fight. Their reward? Aegon made them lords paramount of the Reach, jumping over dozens of houses with better claims but worse timing. The Florents, Hightowers, and Red Winds had all hesitated, calculated, considered their options. The Tyrells had simply opened their gates. Mathematics rewarded speed over legitimacy. This created a fascinating dynamic that would echo through centuries. The Tyrells owed everything to the Targaryens, their very legitimacy depending on dragon power. They became the most loyal of vassals, not from love, but from necessity. Without the threat of dragons, dozens of houses would challenge their rule. Aegon had created a guard dog that could never bite its master without destroying itself. The same mathematics applied to the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands. When Viken Greyjoy heard that Harren the Black had burned in his own castle, more on that momentarily, he called a king's moot and had himself elected King of the Iron Islands. Then, in a gesture of stunning pragmatic brilliance, he sailed to King's Landing and bent the knee to Aegon, offering his crown as tribute. Aegon's response revealed the deep game he was playing. He confirmed Viken as Lord of the Iron Islands and allowed them to maintain their ancient customs, including reaving, as long as they didn't target the other 6 kingdoms. Consider what this meant. Aegon had transformed the Iron Islands from internal threat to external weapon. Their raiding would now target free cities and foreign shores, their fury directed outward rather than at fellow kingdoms. The Ironborn got to maintain their way of life. Aegon got a navy that paid for itself through plunder of his enemies. The mathematics were elegant, Controlled violence was better than suppressed violence, directed raiders better than resentful subjects. But let us return to Harren the Black and the death of Harrenhal, for here we see the darkest mathematics of Aegon's conquest. Harren had spent 40 years building the greatest castle Westeros had ever seen. Harrenhal's walls rose higher than any others, its towers scraped the sky, its gates could withstand any ram. Harren had calculated perfectly for a world of sieges and armies. He had not calculated for a world where stone melted like ice in summer. When Aegon arrived at Harrenhal, he offered Harren the same terms as everyone else. Bend the knee, keep your castle, rule as my vassal. Harren refused, believing his walls impregnable. Stone does not burn, he famously declared. Aegon's response has echoed through history. When the sun sets, your line shall end. That night, Balerion rose high above Harrenhal, so high he seemed just another star. Then he fell, diving with wings folded, opening his mouth only at the last second to breathe dragon flame directly down into the towers. The stone didn't just burn, it melted, flowing like lava. The towers glowed like candles, visible for miles in every direction. Every person in that castle died, from King Harren to the smallest scullery maid. The message wasn't subtle. Resistance equaled extinction. But observe the strategic precision. Aegon didn't burn every castle that resisted. He burned one, the greatest one, and let that example speak for all. Harrenhal became a mathematical proof. If the greatest castle couldn't protect you, no castle could. Every lord in Westeros suddenly recalculated the value of their walls. Stone and mortar, accumulated over centuries, became worthless overnight. The only protection now was submission. The psychological impact transcended mere military strategy. Harrenhal remained a ruin, too damaged to rebuild, too cursed to inhabit for long. Every lord who passed it, every merchant who glimpsed its melted towers, every child who heard its ghost stories learned the same lesson. This is what happens when you refuse the dragon. The castle became a mathematics textbook written in melted stone. Resist and become this, submit and avoid this. Yet Aegon's greatest mathematical achievement wasn't military but administrative. After each conquest, he didn't impose Targaryen law or Valyrian customs. He kept local laws, local customs, local power structures. The genius lay in what he added, not what he replaced. Above all local authorities, he placed his Iron Throne. Above all local laws, he placed royal decrees. Above all local armies, he placed dragons. It was a layer cake of authority, with existing structures intact but superseded. This meant that for most people, life barely changed. The same lords ruled them, the same laws governed them, the same customs comforted them. Only at the very top, in matters of high justice and royal taxation, did the new order intrude. Aegon had discovered that you could conquer a continent without actually changing it. You simply placed yourself above what already existed. The Iron Throne itself embodied this mathematics. Forged from the swords of defeated enemies, heated by Balerion's breath, it was deliberately uncomfortable. Legend says Aegon designed it this way to remind kings that they should never sit easy. But the deeper mathematics were more subtle. Each sword represented a defeated house, yet those houses still existed, still ruled their lands. The throne said, "I defeated you all, but I also let you all survive." It was threat and promise combined. Mathematics made metal. By conquest's end, Aegon had transformed 2,000 men into a continental empire, not by defeating 3 million, but by convincing 3 million that defeat was unnecessary. His mathematics were simple. Early submission brought rewards, late submission brought survival, resistance brought annihilation. He had weaponized game theory on a civilizational scale, creating a system where rational actors had only one rational choice. But the numbers tell only part of the story. 6 kingdoms submitted. but one never did. Dawn resisted, not through military might, but through different mathematics, the arithmetic of absence, the calculus of guerrilla resistance, the algebra of making conquest cost more than it gained. They proved that even dragons couldn't conquer what wouldn't stand still to be conquered. In our next chapter, we'll see what happened when Aegon's descendants inherited dragons, but not his strategic genius. We'll discover how an abundance of dragon riders created a crisis no one had foreseen, how competing claims and divided loyalties transformed the ultimate weapon into mutual annihilation. The Dance of Dragons would prove that the mathematics of power work both ways. What dragons could build, dragons could destroy, and when the equations balanced perfectly, the sum was zero. There exists in nature a phenomenon called the paradox of plenty. Give a forest too many nutrients, and the trees grow so thick they block out the sun, killing everything beneath them, eventually destroying themselves. Give a predator too much prey, and they breed beyond sustainability, exhausting their food source, triggering a population collapse. Abundance, it seems, carries within itself the seeds of scarcity. The Targaryens discovered this paradox written in dragon flame and blood. For the first time in recorded history, a single family controlled not just one or two dragons, but nearly 20. By the reign of King Viserys I, dragon eggs cluttered the warm vaults beneath Dragonstone like jeweled promises of power. Dragon riders filled the skies above King's Landing in displays that made the small folk weep with awe and terror. The Targaryens had achieved what old Valyria at its height had reserved for 40 families. They had concentrated ultimate power into a single bloodline. They had created a bomb with too many fuses. Consider the mathematics that had served Aegon so well. 3 dragons, 3 riders, 1 purpose. The equation was elegant in its simplicity. But what happens when you have 20 dragons and 30 potential riders? What happens when every second son and displaced daughter has access to a nuclear weapon? What happens when the monopoly on power becomes a marketplace of competing apocalypses? The problem began, as problems often do, with success. Aegon's grandson, Jaehaerys I, would be remembered as the conciliator, the greatest king Westeros ever knew. For 55 years he ruled with wisdom that seemed almost supernatural. He built roads that connected the realm, established laws that unified it, and most crucially, bred dragons. Like a man expecting war with heaven itself, under Jaehaerys dragons multiplied. Vermithor and Silverwing, Meleys and Caraxes, a dozen others whose names would soon be written in fire across the sky. Each dragon needed a rider of Targaryen blood. Each rider needed purpose, position, meaning. Jaehaerys managed this abundance through sheer force of personality and political genius, balancing his dragon-riding children and grandchildren like a man juggling lit torches. But even he must have sensed the danger. On his deathbed, he reportedly whispered, "The dragons are too many, and we are too few to manage what we've made." He was both wrong and right. There weren't too few Targaryens, there were too many. When Viserys I took the throne, he inherited a kingdom at absolute peace, and a family armed for absolute war. His daughter Rhaenyra rode Syrax. His brother Daemon commanded Caraxes, the bloodworm. His children, by his second wife, would soon claim dragons of their own. Nobles with drops of dragon blood began eyeing eggs and hatchlings. The pyramid of power that Aegon had built with its point firmly at the top had inverted. Now the weapons of conquest were scattered among princes and princesses, bastards and cousins, each one capable of melting armies, but united by nothing but blood that grew thinner with each generation. Viserys, kind and scholarly, tried to manage through love what Jaehaerys had managed through wisdom. He named his daughter Rhaenyra his heir, the first woman designated to rule the 7 kingdoms. The realm accepted this, grudgingly, while Viserys lived. But when he remarried and had sons, he created a mathematical impossibility. 2 competing claims to the throne, each backed by dragons, each supported by laws and precedents that contradicted the other. Think about the strategic insanity of this situation. In any other kingdom, a succession dispute meant choosing between claimants who commanded different amounts of conventional force, more soldiers, better alliances, superior positioning. But in Targaryen politics, each claimant potentially commanded dragons. The difference between victory and defeat wasn't measured in thousands of soldiers, but in the temperament of giant fire-breathing predators who bonded to teenagers nursing grudges. The Dragon Keepers of Dragonstone understood what the royal family refused to see. These men, who spoke only High Valyrian, who spent their lives tending the dragons, noticed troubling patterns. Dragons raised together were becoming aggressive toward each other. Dragons were choosing riders based on inscrutable criteria that seemed to favor the bold and the angry over the wise and cautious. Most terrifyingly, dragons were growing larger and more numerous than the available food supply could sustain. They were eating sheep faster than sheep could breed, demanding tribute in cattle that the realm struggled to provide. One dragon keeper, whose name is lost to history, supposedly told Prince Daemon, "In Valyria, 40 families shared the burden. Here, one family holds all the fire. Wood stacked too high burns everything when lit." Daemon laughed. He shouldn't have. When Viserys I died, the mathematical impossibility became inevitable reality. His daughter Rhaenyra, his named heir, commanded support from houses that honored the old king's wishes. His son, Aegon II, eldest male heir, commanded support from houses that honored tradition. Both had dragons, both had riders, both had absolute certainty in their cause. The realm split not along lines of geography or economics, but along lines of competing legitimacies, each side's argument reinforced by Dragonflame. The Dance of Dragons, as the singers would later call it, was not a war but a mathematical proof of mutual annihilation. Watch how it progressed, not through strategic brilliance, but through escalating destruction that neither side could stop once started. Rhaenyra controlled more dragons initially: Syrax, Caraxes, Vermax, Arax, Tyraxes, and Moondancer, with Meleys soon joining. Aegon II had fewer but deadlier Vhagar, the last of the Conquest dragons, larger than all others combined, plus Sunfire, Dreamfire, and Tessarion. The Blacks had numbers. The Greens had Vhagar. In conventional warfare, this imbalance would matter. In dragon warfare, it meant only that both sides could destroy each other completely. The first true dragon battle shocked everyone who thought they understood warfare. When Prince Aemond, riding Vhagar, met Prince Lucerys on Arax above Shipbreaker Bay, it wasn't a battle, it was a murder. Vhagar, over a century old, massive beyond comprehension, tore the young dragon Arax apart in seconds. Pieces of dragon and prince fell into the storm-tossed sea like rain made of meat and metal. But here's what the singers don't tell you. Aemond hadn't meant to kill his nephew. He'd meant to frighten him. But dragons aren't swords you can sheathe. Once blood is in the air, once the ancient predator instincts activate, riders become passengers to their dragon's rage. Aemond discovered what the Targaryens had forgotten in their century of dominance. Dragons are not tools but partners, and partnership requires agreement. When dragon and rider disagree, the dragon wins. This loss of control cascaded through the war. At Rook's Rest, when Aemond and Vhagar arrived to support Aegon II and Sunfire against Meleys and Princess Rhaenys, the battle became a three-way catastrophe. Dragons slammed into each other at heights that turned falls lethal. Dragonflame met Dragonflame, creating firestorms that melted armor a mile away. Meleys died, Rhaenys died, Sunfire was crippled, Aegon II was burned beyond recognition, and Vhagar, ancient, terrible Vhagar, survived. With wounds that would never fully heal, the mathematics were clear to anyone who could count. At this rate of exchange, there would be no dragons left within a year, but stopping had become impossible. Each dead dragon demanded vengeance. Each dead rider left a dragon that might accept a new rider from the enemy. The weapons themselves had become the stakes of the war. Then came the strategic masterstroke that was also a civilization-level disaster: the dragon seeds. Rhaenyra's son Jacaerys proposed something that broke every tradition of Targaryen power. Let those with any dragon blood, no matter how distant or bastard-born, attempt to ride the unclaimed dragons. It was democratizing the nuclear arsenal, hoping quantity could overcome quality. The call went out across Dragonstone and Driftmark. Anyone who could prove or claim Targaryen or Valyrian descent could try to claim a dragon. Hundreds answered. Most died, burned, eaten, or simply rejected so violently they fell from great heights. But some succeeded. Hugh Hammer claimed Vermithor, the Bronze Fury, second only to Vhagar in size. Ulf White mounted Silverwing. Adam Velaryon rode Seasmoke. Nettles, a nobody, a nothing, a teenage girl with no confirmed bloodline, somehow tamed Sheepstealer. Think about what this meant for the power structure of Westeros. For a century, dragon riding had been the exclusive province of royalty. Now bastards and bootleggers commanded the power to destroy armies. The monopoly hadn't just broken it, had shattered into pieces that could never be reassembled. Every future ambitious person with a drop of dragon blood would remember: in chaos, crowns can be claimed by anyone brave enough to approach a dragon. But the dragon seeds brought a worse problem: loyalty unmoored from legitimacy. Hugh Hammer and Ulf White, drunk on power no bastard had ever wielded, began to wonder why they should serve anyone. When they betrayed Rhaenyra at Tumbleton, turning their dragons against the very cause that had elevated them, they proved that distributing ultimate power to the desperate creates not allies but rivals. The war's escalation reached its logical conclusion with what became known as the Storming of the Dragon Pit. The small folk of King's Landing, driven mad by starvation and sermons claiming dragons were demons, attacked the Dragon Pit where several dragons were chained. It should have been impossible, humans, with axes and hammers against dragons. But dragons in chains, dragons in enclosed spaces, dragons already wounded from fighting each other, proved vulnerable to sheer numbers and suicidal courage. 5 dragons died that night, pulled down by hundreds of humans who died by thousands to kill them. The mathematical absurdity of it, peasants destroying the ultimate weapons, revealed the final paradox of dragon power. Dragons were unstoppable in the sky but vulnerable on the ground. They needed infrastructure, needed feeding, needed keepers. The very concentration of dragons in one place that had seemed like strength became the weakness that doomed them. The climactic dragon battle, fought above the God's Eye between Prince Daemon on Caraxes and Prince Aemond on Vhagar, solved the equation with brutal simplicity. The 2 dragons, locked in a death spiral, crashed into the lake at terminal velocity. Both riders died. Both dragons died. The 2 greatest weapons remaining to either side eliminated each other in mutual murder. It was the war in microcosm power so evenly matched that using it meant destroying it. By war's end, the mathematics had balanced to 0. Of the 20 dragons that had existed at the war's beginning, only 4 survived, and those were either too young, too wounded, or too traumatized to matter. Hundreds of thousands of humans had died. The realm's economy had collapsed. Entire bloodlines had been extinguished. The Targaryens had won the war, in the sense that a Targaryen still sat the throne, but they had lost everything that made that throne matter. The last dragon of the dance, a stunted, twisted thing no bigger than a mastiff, died during the reign of Aegon III, who would forever be known as Dragonbane despite desperately trying to hatch new ones. The eggs remained, warm and beautiful and absolutely lifeless. Whatever combination of magic, blood and circumstance had allowed dragons to thrive had been broken by their very abundance and the violence it enabled. Consider the strategic lesson written in the ashes of the dragon pit. Power concentrated becomes power contested. The Targaryens had tried to monopolize violence on a scale that made violence inevitable. Every dragon was simultaneously their greatest strength and a potential usurper's path to the throne. Every new dragon rider diluted the exclusivity that made dragon riding valuable. Every dragon egg was both insurance and threat. The maesters of the Citadel, studying the war in later years, developed what they called the dragon paradox. It states, the number of dragons a realm can sustain is inversely proportional to the number of potential riders. One dragon with one rider creates stability through monopoly. 3 dragons with 3 united riders can conquer continents, but 20 dragons with 30 potential riders creates only chaos, as the weapons themselves become worth fighting over. The dance also revealed something about the nature of dragons that the Targaryens had forgotten in their century of dominance. Dragons were not horses that breathed fire. They were apex predators, with intelligence approaching human, with memories that lasted lifetimes, with hatreds that could override their riders' commands. Vhagar killed Arrax, not because Aemond commanded it, but because Vhagar wanted to. Sunfire sought out and devoured Rhaenyra, not from loyalty to Aegon II, but from dragon rage at dragon rivals. The Targaryens had made the classic mistake of confusing correlation with control. Yes, dragons bonded with riders of Valyrian blood. Yes, riders could generally direct their dragon's actions, but when dragon instinct conflicted with rider intent, instinct won. And the instinct of dragons, it turned out, was not to serve but to dominate. Put too many dominators in the same sky, and they would dominate each other into extinction. After the dance, the Targaryens faced a terrible new mathematics. They ruled through the memory of dragons, not the reality. The throne was still iron made from dragon-melted swords, but no dragons remained to melt new ones. They had to discover if power gained through ultimate weapons could be maintained through their absence. They had to transform from dragon lords to kings, from conquerors to administrators, from threats to politicians. In our next chapter, we'll explore how they managed this transition, building institutions to replace intimidation, bureaucracy to replace burning, and soft power to replace the hard power they had destroyed through their own success. We'll see how a throne built on dragonfire learned to rule through gold, ravens, and carefully managed marriages. The Age of Dragons had ended in mutual annihilation, but the Game of Thrones had only just begun. The last dragon died on a humid summer morning in the year 153, after Aegon's conquest, expiring with a wheeze that sounded almost like relief. She was no bigger than a cat, her scales dull green touched with bronze, her wings too weak to lift her own weight. The dragon keepers, those last guardians of a dead age, wept as they wrapped her small body in crimson cloth. King Aegon III, called Dragonbane, though he had desperately tried to save them, stood in the shadow of the Red Keep and spoke words that would define an era. The age of dragons is done. The age of men has begun. He was wrong. It wasn't the age of men that began that day, it was the age of institutions. Consider the mathematical problem the Targaryens now faced. For 150 years, their rule had rested on a simple equation: obedience or annihilation. Every lord who contemplated rebellion had only to look at Harrenhal's melted towers to remember the price of resistance. Every peasant who cursed their taxes knew that dragons could arrive faster than prayers. Fear had been the invisible foundation beneath every law, every decree, every bent knee. Now that foundation had crumbled to ash, and the Targaryens had to discover if a throne built on dragonfire could stand on parchment and promises. The genius of what followed wasn't in any single king's brilliance, but in the collective adaptation of a dynasty learning to evolve or die. Watch how they transformed, like a creature shedding scales for skin, trading the spectacular for the systematic. Where once a dragon's roar settled disputes, now a raven's arrival would have to suffice. Where once dragon flame enforced borders, now marriages and money would need to hold them. The first innovation was almost accidental. Aegon III, traumatized by watching his mother devoured by a dragon, couldn't bear anything that reminded him of the creatures. He retreated into administration, finding solace in ledgers and laws rather than the grand gestures of kingship. His small council, previously advisors to power, became power itself. The hand of the king transformed from the king's voice to the kingdom's brain. The master of coin evolved from treasurer to economic architect. The master of whisperers, that position created by necessity, became the kingdom's nervous system. Think about the elegance of this structure. 7 kingdoms, each with its own traditions, its own laws, its own proud histories, now united not by fear, but by bureaucracy. Every lord had to send taxes to the master of coin, had to respond to ravens from the Grand Maester, had to worry about what the master of whisperers might know. The Iron Throne had become the centre of a web, and the strands were made of information and obligation rather than flame. The maesters of the citadel, those grey rats who had watched the dance of dragons with careful eyes and calculating minds, understood their moment had come. For centuries they had preserved knowledge, advised lords, and maintained the Raven network that allowed communication across vast distances. Now, with dragons gone, their monopoly on long-distance communication and literacy became a form of power as absolute as Dragonfire had been. Every castle needed a maester. Every maester had been trained at the citadel. Every piece of important information flowed through maester-sent ravens. The citadel didn't rule, it didn't need to. It simply made itself indispensable to anyone who did rule. When lords needed to verify claims, they consulted maesters. When kings needed to understand economics, they turned to maesters. When anyone needed to communicate beyond shouting distance, they required maesters. The faith of the Seven, defanged by Maegor the Cruel a century earlier, began to recover its influence through different means. Without military orders, the faith couldn't threaten rebellion, but it could shape minds. Every sermon, in every sept, in every village reminded the small folk that the king ruled by divine right, not dragon right, but the Seven's blessing. The High Septon became not a rival to royal power, but its spiritual validator. Kings needed legitimacy, and the faith provided it in exchange for gold, influence, and carefully maintained autonomy. But the true revolution came through marriage. Watch how the Targaryens, who had wed brother to sister for centuries to keep their bloodline pure for dragon bonding, suddenly discovered the strategic value of other people's daughters and sons. Each marriage became a treaty written in flesh. Each child became a peace sealed in blood. The realm wasn't conquered anymore, it was interrelated. Daeron II, called the Good, exemplified this transformation. When he took the throne, Dorne still stood independent, the one kingdom. Dragons had never conquered. Previous kings had tried war, tried threats, tried everything except the one thing that worked: patience and marriage. Daeron wed the Dornish princess Miriah Martell and wed his sister to the ruling prince of Dorne. In a single generation, what a century of warfare couldn't achieve. 2 weddings accomplished. Dorne joined the realm not as conquered subjects but as equals, their laws respected, their customs maintained. Consider the strategic brilliance of this approach. War would have cost thousands of lives and gold dragons beyond counting. Even victory would have left Dorne resentful, requiring garrisons and constant vigilance. But marriage? Marriage cost nothing but pride, and gained not just territory but loyalty. The Martells became defenders of a throne, their blood now shared rather than enemies of an occupier. The economy, too, transformed from plunder to policy. The masters of coin discovered that consistent taxation yielded more than sporadic extortion. Trade agreements generated more wealth than tribute. The crown began lending money rather than just collecting it, creating dependencies more binding than chains. Lords who owed the crown gold couldn't rebel without losing everything. Merchants who relied on royal charters for trade routes became the throne's most reliable supporters. The gold cloaks of King's Landing embodied this new form of power. Not an army but a police force, not conquerors but keepers of order. 2,000 men with cudgels and authority became more useful than dragons for day-to-day governance. They couldn't melt castles, but they could arrest thieves, enforce laws, and most importantly, create the perception of royal power as omnipresent and ordinary rather than spectacular and sporadic. The Master of Whisperers, that position that would have seemed unnecessary when dragons could simply burn secrets away, became perhaps the most powerful seat on the small council. Information became currency, and secrets became weapons. Knowing which lord was plotting, which merchant was smuggling, which heir was bastard-born, this knowledge prevented more rebellions than dragons ever had. Fear of being known replaced fear of being burned, but observe the hidden danger in this institutional power. It could be captured. When dragons ruled, only Targaryens could rule because only Targaryens could ride dragons. But institutions? Anyone could sit in the hand's chair. Anyone could become master of coin. Anyone with enough cunning could build a spy network to rival the crowns. The Targaryens had democratized power without meaning to, creating tools of governance that others could learn to use. The Blackfyre rebellions proved this danger real. When King Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, he created competing claims to the throne not backed by dragons but by legal precedent. Daemon Blackfyre, the king's bastard, couldn't claim a dragon, but he could claim the sword. Blackfyre could claim legitimacy through acknowledgement, could claim support through charisma and competence rather than dragonfire. 5 Blackfyre rebellions would shake the realm over 60 years, each one proving that institutional power was only as strong as the institutions themselves. Laws could be interpreted differently, precedents could be challenged, legitimacy could be questioned. Without dragons to end debates with finality, every succession became a potential crisis, every law a subject for interpretation, every institution a prize to be captured rather than a tool to be wielded. The tragedy of Summerhall revealed how desperately the Targaryens missed their dragons. Prince Aegon, later called Egg when he became King Aegon V, attempted to hatch dragon eggs through wildfire and sorcery, trying to recreate the power that had once seemed birthright. The castle burned, killing the king and many others, proving that some powers, once lost, couldn't be reclaimed through desire alone. The dragons were gone, and with them the simple certainty of Targaryen dominance. Yet something remarkable emerged from this loss. The 7 kingdoms, unified first by fear, held together by habit. Lords who had sworn to the Iron Throne because of dragons continued swearing because that's what lords did. Taxes flowed to King's Landing not because anyone feared dragonfire, but because the system required it. The realm had developed institutional momentum governance by inertia rather than force. The small council became more powerful than most kings, each member controlling networks of influence that reached into every corner of the realm. The Grand Maester commanded every castle's source of learning and communication. The Master of Ships controlled trade and naval power. The Master of Laws shaped justice itself. The Lord Commander of the King's Guard embodied military honor. Together, they formed a government that could function even with a weak king, or sometimes despite a mad one. Consider King Aerys II, the Mad King, whose insanity would have been manageable in the Age of Dragons. He had dragons, after all, to enforce his madness. But in the institutional age, madness became intolerable. When he burned lords with wildfire instead of dragonfire, it wasn't divine right but criminal murder. When he broke laws instead of making them, the institutions themselves began to resist. The realm had developed antibodies against misrule. The great houses, meanwhile, had spent a century and a half accumulating regional power that dragons had once kept in check. The Starks ruled the north more absolutely than any Targaryen king ruled them. The Lannisters' gold gave them influence that rivaled the Crown's. The Tyrells fed the realm and could starve it at will. The Baratheons commanded loyalty through strength rather than fear. Each house had become an institution unto itself, complete with its own networks, armies, and spheres of influence. This dispersion of power created what the Maesters called dynamic equilibrium, no single force strong enough to dominate, all forces strong enough to resist domination. It was stable, but stability and strength are not the same thing. The realm held together not because it had to, but because alternatives seemed worse. Every lord knew that chaos would hurt them more than taxes. Every merchant knew that war would destroy trade. Every peasant knew that broken kingdoms meant marauding armies. But this consensus-based power had a fatal weakness. It required consensus. When Robert's rebellion began, the institutions that should have prevented it instead enabled it. The Great Council that could have resolved the succession peacefully had no authority to override a mad king. The faith that should have provided moral guidance had been defanged too thoroughly to matter. The small council that should have governed wisely had been corrupted by the king's paranoia. The great houses that should have been checks on royal power became the rebellion's backbone. The rebellion succeeded not through military brilliance, but through institutional failure. Every system the Targaryens had built to maintain power without dragons became a tool their enemies could use against them. The Raven network spread calls to rebellion as easily as royal commands. The marriage alliances that should have bound the realm together became the rebellion's organizing principle. Stark, Baratheon, Tully, and Arryn, united by wed bonds as much as shared grievance. The very laws the Targaryens had established became the rebellion's justification. The king had broken the feudal contract, so the vassals were free to choose a new king. When the Targaryens fell, they fell not in dragonfire but in bureaucratic collapse. No great battle ended their dynasty, just a prince with a hammer and a king with a sword, fighting in a river while the institutions that should have prevented such a meeting stood by and watched. The Iron Throne remained. The council continued meeting. The ravens kept flying. Only the family name at the top changed, proving that institutional power, unlike dragon power, didn't require any particular bloodline to function. Yet even as Robert took the throne, rumours began in the east. A beggar king and his sister, last of the dragon lords, wandering the free cities. Dragon eggs, given as a wedding gift, beautiful but dead as stone. Whispers of dreams, of prophecies, of ancient magic stirring after centuries of sleep. The institutional age had proven that kingdoms could function without dragons, but it had also proven that such kingdoms could be taken by anyone strong enough, clever enough, or lucky enough to seize the institutions. In our next chapter, we'll see how Robert's rebellion succeeded through alliance arithmetic, how 5 great houses discovered that together they were stronger than any throne. We'll explore how victory became its own defeat, as the rebels discovered that overthrowing a government is far easier than running one, and how the absence of a common enemy revealed that allies make terrible friends when the war is won. In the 14th year of King Aerys II's reign, Lord Rickard Stark did something that would have seemed unremarkable to any casual observer but revolutionary to those who understood power's deeper mathematics. He betrothed his daughter Lyanna to Robert Baratheon and his son Brandon to Catelyn Tully. 2 marriages, nothing more. Lords had been wedding their children to each other for thousands of years, but Rickard Stark wasn't just arranging marriages. He was solving an equation that had been unbalanced for 3 centuries. Consider what these betrothals meant in the arithmetic of power. The north, isolated and vast, allying with the Stormlands, martial and proud. The Riverlands, central and vulnerable, binding to the north's strength. Add to this the fosterage of Rickard's younger son Eddard, with Jon Arryn in the Vale, and suddenly 4 of the 7 kingdoms were interconnected, not by royal decree, but by bonds of blood and affection. It was a coalition built not to rebel but to exist a mathematical counterweight to the Iron Throne that had grown complacent in its monopoly. The Mad King, paranoid but not stupid, sensed the danger. His advisor, Lord Tywin Lannister, dismissed it. "They're strengthening ties," Tywin reportedly said. "As vassals should. A strong realm needs strong regions." But Tywin, brilliant in finance and administration, had missed the fundamental equation. When regional power multiplied through alliance exceeds central power, maintained through tradition, the center cannot hold. Then came the spark that transformed potential energy into kinetic rebellion, though spark is too small a word for what happened. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, silver-haired and beautiful, beloved by the realm, married with 2 children, crowned Lyanna Stark, Queen of Love and Beauty at the Tournament of Harrenhal, then disappeared with her. Whether she went willingly or was abducted remains history's great mystery. What matters is what happened next. Brandon Stark, heir to Winterfell, rode to King's Landing with a fury that burned hotter than wildfire. He stood before the Red Keep and shouted for Rhaegar to come out and die. Think about the raw courage or stupidity of that moment. A single lord's heir, demanding the death of the Crown Prince in the shadow of the Iron Throne itself. In the Age of Dragons he would have been ash before finishing his sentence. In the institutional age he should have been arrested, tried, perhaps exiled. Instead, King Aerys had him murdered. Not executed, murdered, slowly and horribly, while forcing his father, Lord Rickard, to watch, burning the elder Stark alive while the younger strangled himself trying to save him. The Mad King had broken the fundamental contract between king and vassal, protection in exchange for loyalty. Worse, he then demanded that Jon Arryn send him the heads of Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, wards who had committed no crime except being friends to the murdered. Jon Arryn's refusal was the moment potential rebellion became inevitable mathematics. He faced a simple calculation: betray 2 young men he loved as sons and maintain his honor as Lord of the Vale, or protect them and commit treason. He chose love over law, and in that choice the rebellion found its moral center. This wasn't about power or ambition, it was about justice denied and innocence threatened. The equation had shifted from political to personal. Watch how quickly the arithmetic aligned. The North rose for their murdered lord and heir. The Vale rose for their lord's honor. The Stormlands rose for their lord's betrothed. The Riverlands, caught between loyalty and logic, calculated that Hoster Tully's daughters wed to rebellion leaders meant the Tullys' future lay with the rebels. 4 kingdoms united not by conquest but by consensus, not by fear but by fury. Against them stood the Iron Throne with its traditional allies, the Reach with its vast armies and wealth, Dorne with its fierce warriors and Targaryen marriage ties, and theoretically, the Westerlands with their gold and discipline. The Royalists should have won. They had more men, more resources, more legitimacy. They had everything except the one thing that mattered: unity of purpose. The Battle of Ashford revealed the Royalists' mathematical weakness. Lord Randil Tarly, commanding Reach forces, defeated Robert Baratheon's army, sending him fleeing north. By any strategic logic, Tarly should have pursued, should have destroyed the rebellion's military leader before he could regroup. Instead, the Reach forces stopped to besiege Storm's End, held by Robert's younger brother Stannis. Why waste precious time and men on a strategically irrelevant castle? Because the Reach lords weren't fighting for the Mad King, they were fighting for their own advantage. Storm's End was rich lands that could be claimed after victory. Robert Baratheon was a dangerous enemy who might escape and cause future problems. The Tyrells, new to paramount lordship and insecure in their power, saw the rebellion as an opportunity to eliminate regional rivals, not save a dynasty. Their mathematics were local, not global. Meanwhile, the rebels displayed coordination that seemed almost supernatural. At the Battle of the Bells, when John Connington had Robert trapped in Stony Sept, Eddard Stark and Hoster Tully arrived with reinforcements at the perfect moment, not because of luck, but because of trust. Each rebel lord knew the others would come, would fight, would die if necessary for their shared cause. Their arithmetic was simple. We all survive, or we all hang. But the true strategic masterpiece was Tywin Lannister's calculated neutrality. The richest, most powerful lord in the realm, with the most disciplined army, sat at Casterly Rock and did absolutely nothing. He answered neither the Crown's calls for aid nor the rebels' requests for alliance. He waited, watching the equations balance and rebalance with each battle, calculating the precise moment when his intervention would matter most not to a cause but to himself. Consider Tywin's position. He had served as Hand of the King for 20 years, building the realm's prosperity, only to be dismissed and insulted by King Aerys. His daughter Cersei had been rejected as Rhaegar's bride. His son Jaime had been elevated to the Kingsguard, an honour that was actually theft, removing his heir from inheritance. Tywin owed the Mad King nothing, but had everything to lose from backing the wrong side. So he transformed waiting into warfare, using time as his weapon. The Battle of the Trident changed everyone's calculations. Prince Rhaegar, returning from wherever he had been with Lyanna, led 40,000 men against Robert's 35,000. The numbers favoured the royalists, but numbers had ceased to matter when Robert's warhammer caved in Rhaegar's ruby-encrusted breastplate, scattering gems across the ford like drops of blood turned to treasure. He didn't just kill a prince, he solved the rebellion's fundamental equation. Without Rhaegar, the royalist cause collapsed into competing interests. The Dornish, who had fought for Rhaegar's wife and children, began withdrawing. The Reach Lords, who had expected rewards from a grateful dynasty, saw only a mad king who might burn them next. The Kingsguard, bound by oath to defend the royal family, found that family scattered, some in King's Landing, some in Dorne, some at Dragonstone. Unity shattered into fragments, each calculating its own survival. Now, Tywin moved, and his movement was mathematical poetry. He brought his army to King's Landing's gates, proclaiming loyalty to King Aerys. The Mad King, desperate for any aid, opened those gates. Within hours, Lannister men were sacking the city. Tywin was ordering the deaths of Rhaegar's children, and Jaime Lannister was sliding his sword between the Mad King's ribs. Tywin had calculated perfectly, arriving just late enough to avoid the war's risks, just early enough to claim credit for victory. The arithmetic of the rebellion's conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. Robert had the love handsome, charismatic, with the common touch that made soldiers die for him. Eddard had the honour unbending, unquestioned, the moral centre everyone trusted. Jon Arryn had the wisdom experienced, patient, understanding how to transform military victory into political stability. Tywin had the gold mountains of it, rivers of it, enough to rebuild what war had destroyed. But here's where the mathematics turn treacherous. The skills needed to win a rebellion are precisely the opposite of those needed to rule a kingdom. Robert's rage that had shattered Rhaegar's chest couldn't balance a budget. Eddard's honour that had united the North couldn't navigate court intrigue. Jon Arryn's wisdom was wearing thin, with age, and Tywin's gold came with interest rates measured in political influence. Robert took the throne because he had the best claim his grandmother had been, a Targaryen, and because he had the biggest hammer. But watch what happened immediately. He married Cersei Lannister, not for love or even politics, but for gold to pay the crown's debts. He made Jon Arryn his hand, not because Jon wanted power, but because Robert couldn't bear the tedium of rule. He sent Eddard back north, not from friendship but from fear that his friend would judge him as he descended into drink and debauchery. The rebellion had succeeded through perfect arithmetic, 4 kingdoms united by purpose, defeating 3 divided by doubt. But ruling required different mathematics entirely. Consensus, which had won the war, became paralysis in peace. Every great house that had supported the rebellion expected rewards. The Tullys wanted trade concessions. The Arryns wanted court positions. The Starks wanted to be left alone. The Lannisters wanted everything. Robert's solution was to give everyone what they wanted, paying with gold the crown didn't have, making promises the realm couldn't keep. The debt that had been manageable under Aerys began multiplying exponentially. The Iron Bank of Braavos, those faceless men who counted coins like prayers, began charging interest rates that would have horrified earlier kings. But Robert didn't care. He had won his throne through warfare and would keep it through inertia, letting others manage the mathematics while he drank and whored and remembered when equations were simpler. The small council became a marketplace of competing interests. Littlefinger, rising from nothing to master of coin, discovered he could create wealth from air through creative accounting, making himself indispensable while secretly undermining everything. Varys, the spider, master of whisperers, served not the throne but the idea of the throne, manipulating information to maintain a balance that prevented both tyranny and collapse. Each council member pursued their own arithmetic, their calculations intersecting only occasionally with the realm's actual needs. Meanwhile, the lords who had won the rebellion discovered that victory tastes remarkably like defeat when you're still paying taxes to a different king doing the same things the old king did. The North got nothing from southern politics. The Vale retreated to its mountains. The Stormlands watched their lord grow fat and bitter. The Riverlands found themselves, as always, caught between everyone else's ambitions. The Targaryens were gone, but not dead. Viserys and Daenerys, children during the rebellion, escaped to Essos, carrying with them claims that mathematics couldn't quite dismiss. Every lord who had bent the knee to Robert remembered that they had once bent it to dragons. The rebellion had proven that thrones could be taken by force. What it hadn't proven was whether they could be held by anything else. 15 years passed. A generation grew up knowing only Robert's peace, such as it was. The arithmetic of power seemed stable, great houses balanced against each other, the crown weak but not worthless, the realm functioning through momentum rather than management. But beneath this stability, new equations were forming. Cersei's children, golden-haired and green-eyed, looked nothing like their supposed father. Littlefinger's debts were approaching proportions that couldn't be serviced. Varys's whispers spoke of dragon eggs and eastern ambitions. The rebellion had succeeded through the mathematics of alliance, proving that unified vassals could overthrow any king. But in victory, it had created a new formula: a weak throne, plus strong houses, plus competing interests, equals inevitable chaos. The realm held together, not because the center was strong, but because no single faction was strong enough to claim it alone. It was stability through stalemate, peace through paralysis. In our final chapter, we'll see how this mathematical balance would shatter when ancient forces returned to the equation. Dragons in the east, others in the north, and the Iron Bank's ledgers demanding payment would transform the Game of Thrones from political chess to existential calculus. The rebellion had proven that humans could overthrow humans. What it hadn't prepared anyone for was what happened when the variables included fire-breathing dragons, ice-wielding demons, and debts that could topple kingdoms without swinging a single sword. 3 dragon eggs sat in a brazier of burning wood and flesh, their stone surfaces beginning to crack in the funeral pyre of Khal Drogo. Across the narrow sea, in the vaults of the Iron Bank of Braavos, ledgers showed the crown of Westeros owed more gold than existed in all the mines of Casterly Rock. And beyond the wall, in the lands of always winter, something that had slept for 8,000 years, opened eyes of burning blue. The Game of Thrones, played for centuries with predictable pieces and established rules, was about to discover that the board itself could catch fire. Consider for a moment the impossibility of what was happening. Dragons, extinct for a century and a half, returning to a girl who had never seen Westeros. The dead, walking after millennia of being myth, led by creatures that shouldn't exist. And debt, that most mundane of concepts, becoming a weapon more dangerous than any army. The old mathematics of power soldiers, plus gold, plus alliances equals victory, were about to be divided by infinity and multiplied by impossibility. Daenerys Targaryen walked into that fire, a frightened girl with nothing but a name, and walked out the mother of dragons. But here's what the songs leave out. She also walked out holding the greatest economic disruption in human history. Dragons don't just burn enemies, they transform the fundamental structure of civilization. Every castle becomes obsolete. Every army becomes kindling. Every trade route becomes vulnerable to a teenager with a temperamental pet that breathes destruction. Watch what happened in Slaver's Bay when Daenerys decided to be a liberator. The entire economic structure of three great cities, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, rested on slavery. Not just labor slavery, but slavery as currency, as social structure, as the mathematics underlying all commerce. The Unsullied, those perfect soldier eunuchs, sold for prices that could buy small kingdoms. Bed slaves, scribe slaves, tutor slaves, human beings, transformed into specialized tools, their value calculated as precisely as any commodity. Daenerys looked at this ancient system, this mathematics refined over 5,000 years, and simply said, no. She had dragons. The equations that had balanced for millennia meant nothing to creatures that could melt pyramid walls like butter. 8,000 unsullied, worth more than some nations' treasuries, she freed with a word. 200,000 slaves in Meereen, the economic foundation of the city, she transformed into citizens with a decree. The chaos that followed wasn't just political, it was mathematical. Imagine a modern economy where someone suddenly declared money itself illegal. Every transaction, every debt, every accumulated wealth vanishes. The former slaves had freedom, but no food. The former masters had gold, but no one to grow their crops. The Unsullied had their lives, but no purpose. Daenerys had conquered cities, but couldn't make them function because she had destroyed the equations they ran on without replacing them with new ones. This is the hidden horror of dragons. They're very good at subtraction, but terrible at addition. They can remove obstacles, armies, and cities, but they cannot create trade agreements, agricultural systems, or functioning economies. Daenerys discovered what Aegon the Conqueror had understood. Dragons are tools of conquest, not governance. You can burn a slaver's pyramid in minutes, but building a functioning free society takes generations. Meanwhile, across the world in King's Landing, a different kind of mathematics was destroying the realm from within. The Iron Bank of Braavos, that institution that had seemed so distant and abstract when Robert was borrowing, had become the realm's true ruler. The crown owed 3 million gold dragons to the Lannisters, 2 million to the Faith, and nearly 1 million to the Iron Bank. The interest alone exceeded the crown's annual income. Think about the terrifying elegance of this warfare. The Iron Bank never sent soldiers, never threatened violence, never made demands. They simply stopped lending. Suddenly, the crown couldn't pay the gold cloaks. Soldiers desert when unpaid. They couldn't maintain the royal fleet. Ships rot when not maintained. They couldn't buy grain for the coming winter. Populations rebel when hungry. The Iron Bank had conquered King's Landing without setting foot in Westeros, proving that in the new game, ledgers could be deadlier than swords. Littlefinger, that masterpiece of calculated ambition, understood these new mathematics better than anyone. Born to the smallest of small houses, he had neither armies nor dragons, nor even particularly impressive wealth. What he had was the ability to make 2 + 2 = 5 in the crown's ledgers while pocketing the difference. He transformed debt into power, chaos into opportunity, and everyone else's ambition into his advancement. Watch his strategic genius. He convinced the crown to borrow from the Iron Bank to pay the Lannisters. He convinced the Lannisters to lend more to maintain influence. He convinced everyone that the economy was growing when it was actually eating itself. Each transaction made the realm weaker and Littlefinger more essential. He had discovered that in a game where everyone watched for swords and schemes, the real power lay in compound interest. But the true game changer, the variable that shattered every equation, stirred beyond the wall. The others, White Walkers, Whites, whatever name you give to frozen death, represented something that power politics couldn't process. An enemy that didn't want gold, didn't need land. They didn't care about legitimacy or lineage or any of the 1,000 things men killed each other to possess. They wanted extinction. Not conquest, not subjugation, but the end of all warm life. The Night's Watch, that ancient order that had guarded the wall for 8,000 years, tried to warn the realm. They sent ravens describing the dead walking, corpses with blue eyes that couldn't be killed, creatures of ice that shattered steel like glass. The response from King's Landing? Silence. From Winterfell? Skepticism. From Old Town? Academic interest at best. The greatest threat in human history was approaching, and nobody believed it because it didn't fit their equations. Consider the insanity of this blindness. Lords who would marshal thousands of men to dispute a bridge's ownership couldn't imagine fighting an enemy that wanted no bridges. Kings who spent fortunes on spy networks couldn't conceive of a threat that required no spies to detect. Just look north and see the army of the dead marching. The Game of Thrones had made everyone so sophisticated in their calculations that they couldn't recognize a simple subtraction problem. The dead minus the living equals 0. Jon Snow, bastard of Winterfell, Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, understood what others couldn't. The old mathematics were obsolete. Wildlings versus Night's Watch, bastard versus trueborn, north versus south. These divisions meant nothing when the dead outnumbered the living. He made the impossible choice, allowing the wildlings through the wall, transforming ancient enemies into desperate allies. For this strategic genius, this recognition that the game itself had changed, his own men murdered him. But here's where the new rules revealed themselves in their full terror and glory. Jon Snow didn't stay dead. Melisandre, the Red Priestess with her foreign god and impossible powers, brought him back. Death itself, that ultimate equation balancer, had become negotiable. If death could be reversed, if dragons could be reborn, if the dead could walk, then every law, every assumption, every calculation that civilization rested on was suddenly questionable. The old houses, trapped in their traditional thinking, couldn't adapt to these new variables. The Tyrells, rich beyond measure, thought gold could buy safety from dragons. They were wrong. The Freys, numerous and entrenched, thought violating guest right would have only political consequences. They hadn't considered that in a world where magic was returning, breaking ancient laws might bring ancient punishments. The Boltons, cruel and cunning, thought fear could replace legitimacy. They didn't understand that when real monsters existed, human monsters became redundant. Cersei Lannister, sitting the Iron Throne after destroying the Sept of Baelor with wildfire, embodied the old game played to its ultimate conclusion. She had eliminated her enemies, terrified her subjects, and seized absolute power through conventional means, violence, fear, and the elimination of rivals. But she ruled over a kingdom 6 million gold dragons in debt, facing dragons in the east, death in the north, and starvation in the coming winter. She had won the Game of Thrones, only to discover the throne itself was worthless if the realm it ruled ceased to exist. The equation had become impossibly complex. Dragons plus debt, plus the dead, plus magic, plus climate change in the form of an endless winter approaching. No human mind could calculate all the variables, predict all the outcomes, plan for all contingencies. The Game of Thrones had evolved from chess to three-dimensional calculus, where the rules changed mid-equation and the board itself might spontaneously combust. Yet in this chaos, new forms of power emerged. Bran Stark, crippled and powerless by traditional measurements, became the three-eyed raven, able to see all of history, all of truth, making him potentially the most powerful player in a game where information determined survival. Sam Tarly, mockingly called Sam the Slayer, discovered that obsidian could kill White Walkers, that ancient books contained solutions to modern problems, that knowledge hoarded in dusty libraries might matter more than all the gold in Casterly Rock. The Iron Bank, those faceless men who had seemed so clever with their compound interest, discovered that you cannot collect from the dead, cannot negotiate with dragons, cannot foreclose on a kingdom that no longer exists. Their mathematics, so precisely calculated, hadn't accounted for apocalypse. They had won the game of debt, only to discover that victory meant nothing if civilization ended. The dragons, those symbols of ultimate power returned, proved to be as much liability as asset. They ate resources the realm couldn't spare, destroyed infrastructure that couldn't be rebuilt, and most critically, they could be killed. The Night King demonstrated this by turning Viserion into an undead dragon, proving that even the ultimate weapon could be turned against its wielder. Power had become recursive. Every strength contained its own weakness. Every solution created new problems. The final revelation of the new game was this: winning had become impossible by traditional definitions. You couldn't conquer the dead, you could only survive them. You couldn't rule dragons, you could only hope to influence them. You couldn't pay debts that exceeded the realm's total wealth, you could only delay the reckoning. The Game of Thrones had transformed from a competition to be won into a catastrophe to be survived. Those who adapted to these new rules, who recognized that dragons, debt, and daggers were all symptoms of a changing world rather than problems to be solved, had the best chance of survival. Those who clung to old equations, old alliances, old assumptions, discovered that in a game where the dead could walk and dragons could fly, being right by traditional mathematics meant nothing if you were ash or ice by the new calculus. Imagine standing at the crossroads of these impossible forces. To the east, 3 dragons and a queen who wanted to break the wheel of power itself. To the north, an army of the dead that made all human conflict seem petty. In your vaults, debts that could never be repaid. In your streets, people who had lost faith in every institution that claimed to protect them. The old Game of Thrones, with its predictable moves and established rules, had ended. The new game had no rules at all, only the constant calculation of which impossible threat to face first. This was the ultimate strategic challenge, not how to win, but how to survive long enough for winning to matter again. Not how to claim power, but how to preserve the possibility of power existing at all. Not how to play the game, but how to keep the board from being destroyed entirely. Dragons had returned, but so had the things dragons had once been born to fight. Debt had accumulated to the point where economics became existential threat, and daggers in the dark, those traditional tools of the game, seemed almost quaint when faced with armies that turned your dead against you. The wheel of power that had turned for thousands of years hadn't been broken. It had been revealed as one gear in a much larger machine, a machine that included forces beyond human control, mathematics beyond human comprehension, and stakes beyond human imagination. The Game of Thrones continued, but now it was played on a board where squares could become dragons, pawns could become undead, and the players themselves might discover they were pieces in someone else's game entirely. In the end, those who understood that the rules had changed, that the old mathematics no longer applied, that power itself had been redefined, they were the ones who might just survive to see what game would emerge from the ashes and ice. For in this new world of dragons, debt, and daggers, the greatest strategic wisdom was recognizing that the game you thought you were playing had ended, and something far more terrible and wonderful had begun.